Hi, Dr. J. Franklin Schultz here with a police perspective. This is a topic that has really been a matter of great concern to me for the last couple of decades of my police experience, and perhaps longer than that. This was based on some research that I did with several hundred respondents of various law enforcement officers from various jurisdictions and different ranks. And it is, to me, something that I've just not managed to get a lot of traction on, even though I think it's a super critical issue. Now, this survey is probably over 10 years old. I doubt very much that the statistics have changed very much. If anything, they may have gotten worse, but I don't know until somebody replicates this research. A couple of disclaimers I want to tell you. I've entitled this "The Valor Project," my research, and valor for my purposes is violence against law officer research. Now, I haven't trademarked that name. I've used it for many, many years, but there are other researchers and perhaps other entities that have come up with the same acronym, and that's cool. So I'm not claiming any, first of all, I'm not claiming any ownership other than by use. It's not a registered trademark to me, and I don't want to infringe on somebody that might have gone through the trouble of actually making that an official trademark or registered of some sort. So I apologize in advance if that's a problem with anybody. Secondly, I'm wearing my Police One shirt. I've been a columnist, award-winning columnist for Police One for I don't know, at least 15 years, probably longer. But this particular presentation is not endorsed or sponsored by or validated by Lexipol or any of their offshoots like Police One. I'm very proud of my association with them, by the way. And the FBI I have no association with the FBI other than having had the pleasure of working with them from time to time, and this was given to me by an agent and is just part of my collection of police hats, which reside mostly in a dusty shelf in my closet. But I thought I'd bring that out, partly because I just had a haircut and I'm not really confident in it. Well, so what we're going to do is look through some of the results from a PowerPoint that I have presented in several places. Let's see, I guess it doesn't matter, but the IACP convention in Denver some years ago, the Mississippi Gang Investigators Conference a few years ago, the Violence Against Women Conference that was down in Atlanta quite a while back, and a couple of other organizations, including the National Field Training Officers Association. So I think it's just a super important topic because it is something that is often ignored. Now, I have talked to a prosecutor in Southern California who came to me after a presentation that I made in one of those venues and said, we have a part of our office that is dedicated to crimes against police officers. And I was glad to hear that. I'm sure there are other agencies that do that. But one of the things that is a problem with this issue of violence against police officers is that it is hidden or ignored even by practicing police officers. There is an expectation, again, within the profession and within police leadership and among the general public and policymakers and politicians that, hey, you signed up for it. If you get kicked or injured or shot at or whatever, then that's just part of the job. Well, I disagree with that premise. And I also will point out that police officers who are victims of crime, and I'm not talking about secondary victimization where you just see a lot of stuff and it affects you emotionally and physically and cumulatively, and can be a component of PTSI diagnosis over time. But I'm talking about actually being a victim of a crime. There's no citizen, there's no arrestee, there's no suspect that has a right to violate the law by assaulting or intimidating or destroying property of or threatening or harassing police officers. That is against the law. Police officers have no fewer rights under most states' victims' rights laws. In Colorado, it's a constitutional amendment. In other places, it's a statute where crime victims, violent crime victims, are afforded certain rights, and this is often ignored. Just a personal example, I was assaulted several years ago, and the case was pled out without my knowledge. I had no input. I did fill out a victim's impact statement, but the case was disposed of without my input or without my knowledge. I found out later that it had been reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor with no jail time. Now, whether that was the right outcome or not, it violated the constitutional provisions of the state of Colorado regarding crime victims, and I was feloniously assaulted and was not afforded the same rights that somebody else would have been had they been violently assaulted. So let's look at some of the statistics. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to screen share. So here, and this is just a sample of some of the questions that I asked and responses that I got. It doesn't reflect the entire body of research or any conclusions that I may have drawn from. It's just some raw data. So again, I surveyed several hundred police officers of various jurisdictions and ranks and asked one of these questions was, in the past 12 months, have any of the following happened to you? I've had personal property damage by offenders. I have been hit, pushed, punched, shoved, kicked, or otherwise physically assaulted in a way that caused discomfort. But I did not seek medical attention, such as hitting the ground, hyperflexing a joint, abrasions, bruises, etc. Another possible answer, I have had to seek medical care at an emergency room, hospital, or healthcare provider for an injury resulting from an assault or resistance from a suspect. I've been put at risk for disease because of exposure to bodily fluids from an assault, spitting, biting, etc. And again, that is a felony assault in the state of Colorado. So, and again, this is nationwide. So 13% had property damage done as a result of their duties. 63%, which is the most predominant answer, been hit, pushed, punched, et cetera, 63% of all officers surveyed. And again, this is within the last 12 months. And I asked the same question about within the last 2 years, and of course the numbers are higher. Had to seek medical care, 21%, and been at risk for disease transmission, nearly 40% of all police officers in a 12-month period. Now, as I said in a previous video, the typical statistics that is the statistic that is quoted is 50,000 police officers injured annually, and that's simply absolutely not true, as you can see from these percentages. So the next question that I ask, make that a little bigger for you. I have never been threatened. Only 8.2 police officer. An offender has threatened to report me or cause me to lose my job, 77%. And by the way, again, in Colorado, and I'm sure it's true in other states, if you intimidate a government official in order to change their outcome or their decision about enforcement, that again is a criminal act. An offender has threatened to sue me, 88%. How many have actually been sued? I didn't ask that question. An offender has threatened to assault me if they ever catch me out of uniform, 80%. I've been threatened while off duty by a person or persons with whom I had dealings on duty, 18%. I was threatened with a deadly weapon, including a vehicle, 23%, almost 24% pretty close to a quarter of all police officers within a year of being on duty have been threatened with a deadly weapon. Where does that show up in any other statistic? I'm telling you, it does not. I was injured by a deadly weapon, 2.6%. I lost time from work due to an assault, 13%. I was struck or dragged deliberately by a vehicle. And for some reason that comes up to 0%. I certainly have more than once. I've seriously considered quitting police work because of the danger of injury, disability, death, or stress relating to related to being assaulted. Now, we talk in recent years, and this survey was before, I think even before 2014 Michael Brown thing, 13%. This was before everybody was talking about how can we retain and recruit police officers, and 13% of our cops out there in any given 1 year have thought about, I'm quitting. This is not worth it. So big numbers, I think. Here's that any time in your career, 83% of officers have had this kind of injury. Over half have been required to seek medical care at an emergency room or hospital. I certainly have. I've been put at risk for disease, 71%, and the other 30% just didn't know it because I'm sure that's close to 100%. Now here's what's interesting, I think, and tragic. Most of the time, I don't even ask for charges because I know they won't be prosecuted, 10%. So if we want to have an accurate picture of how many police officers are assaulted in a given time period, this is 10%. Cases that I thought, so there's some frustration. There's either nobody's going to care about my having been assaulted, or I never thought about it too much. And I certainly, at the beginning of my career, I had resisting and assaulting and stuff, and I wrote it off, didn't even charge it, and I would certainly do things differently now. Cases that I thought met the statutory definition of a felony were prosecuted as misdemeanors. That's certainly, in my case, half of police officers say that that's been true. Here's another disturbing stat. The assault on an officer or resisting charges seem to be the first ones dropped when there are multiple charges on a suspect. Here's what happens. Let's take domestic violence, for example. Police officers intervening in a domestic violence gets assaulted or resisted, and they take the perpetrator to jail, the accused to jail. And as often happens, unless you're in a jurisdiction where the prosecutor will roll through the charges regardless of the victim's wishes, if the victim says, oh, I'm not going to cooperate, or I want to drop charges, blah, 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 then, okay, those charges are dropped. But then the assault and resisting charges also go away. Now, would this happen if, for example, it was a drug case? Maybe so. I just think domestic violence is probably one of the main problems where this is perpetrated. But if you go into a scene, you see a mound of fentanyl or cocaine or whatever the drug du jour happens to be in your community, and you make an arrest, and you get resisted or assaulted, and for some reason the charge may be minimized or dropped, they're not as likely to drop the assault on the officer charge, to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it certainly happens. And so almost 2/3 of our cops have experienced this. Prosecution of assaults on police and resisting are very aggressive. They should be. Philosophically, and I said this in my victim impact statement on one particular assault, I said, I personally can forgive the person, that's part of my faith, but I can't forgive the person for what they did to the public, what they did to the badge, what they did to law and order, what that did to society, what that did to my representation of the public in doing my job. So I said, this person needs to go to jail. I forgive them personally, that's a different issue, But in terms of what they've done to somebody else, I can't forgive what you've done to somebody else. I can't forgive what you've done to the 20,000 people in that particular jurisdiction at that particular time that empowered me and entrusted me with enforcing the law. So only fewer than 20% of officers are working in jurisdictions where assaulting an officer is a big deal. And 3.4% have never been the victim of an assault or resisting. I can't imagine why that's not zero, but I asked the question and that's the response. Another question: what's the most accurate statement regarding use of force? I have been the subject of an investigation for use of force when I felt I was really the victim, 2 out of 10 officers. And I understand when there's a use of force, there needs to be an investigation. Was it proper? Was it appropriate? Was it appropriate? Was it proportionate? But the kind of persecution, if you will, that happens to an officer who was a victim in a violent confrontation is pretty frequent. In cases where I was assaulted, I was the only investigating police officer in the case, 25%. Let me make a policy proclamation for you. If you are assaulted, let me tell you this. If you go to an assault call, somebody says, I've been assaulted, I've been injured, I was struck, I was hit, I was threatened, somebody pulled a weapon on me, threatened me with a knife, you wouldn't hand them a statement form and say, well, if you'll just gather all the witnesses and collect the evidence and get statements and just turn that back into me, we'll take a look at it. But that's what we do with police officers a significant amount of time, and certainly probably in what we would consider minor assaults. In other words, you didn't go to the hospital, you didn't break a bone, you didn't get a wound in your flesh. So what we need to be doing is if a police officer is assaulted, another police officer, whether that's a different agency or not is up to y'all, but another police officer ought to objectively investigate that case with that police officer as a victim, just like they would with any other citizen who is the victim of a violent crime. In cases where I was assaulted, there was an uninvolved officer assigned to investigate the case. Now we have 25%. I investigated my own victimization, but in only 25%, according to this survey, another uninvolved officer was assigned to investigate the case. So there's a little disconnect in the numbers there, but they're disturbing, distressing numbers. In cases where the prosecutor filed assault on an officer or resisting arrest, I was consulted on charges and sentencing or allowed to make a statement as a victim, which is required in most states for victims of violent crimes. And only about a third of the officers were given that opportunity to participate in the process as a crime victim, as provided by most statutes. In cases where I was a victim of assault or resisting, the prosecutor made case dispositions without my knowledge or consultation as a victim, 45%. You just would not do that appropriately, legally, for any other violent crime victim, but 45% of officers have had that experience. I've got one more statistic to share with you. I've never been the victim of an assault or resisting arrest. That's 13%. Again, I don't know what those cops are doing. I've been treated like any other victim of assault, only 22%. So 80% of officers don't get the same rights as other citizens. I've been offered monetary. And here's the thing about this statistic. We are mandated to take action. The law, ethics, morality, professionalism requires us to take action, to do something. So that doesn't mean that we have a different level of not being innocent, like an innocent victim. This is not what we're called to do, and just take it without any attention, justice, or even civil suit. And by the way, police officers can sue. Now you say, well, most of the knuckleheads that I deal with don't have a penny to their name anyway. But you know what? I think if you have an injury that anybody else would be able to take to civil court and sue somebody over and hold them civilly accountable, regardless of the criminal outcome of the case, because as you know, the levels of evidence are different, then maybe when he writes that $5 check every month for the next 20 years, they'll think about their accountability. I've been offered monetary compensation, counseling, or other victim services, 11%. You know, again, if we have another victim of violent crime, that's going to be offered to them. We have a victim services officer that may respond, victim impact people. The jury might be allowed to hear a statement. If you are given the opportunity to talk about this traumatic experience, which is a very healthy and preventive mental health service that police departments ought to be offering, it just doesn't happen for 90% of our cops. I filed a civil suit for damages against the person who assaulted me, less than 4%. And again, this ought to be more frequent. Police officer conduct is highly restricted by a lot of different things, but one of those things is the threat of lawsuit. So we might tend to not think about that as an option, but I really think that we should do that more frequently and send the message that there is multiple ways for an offender to be accountable when they damage, assault a person who is the symbol of law and order by a community that entrusts you to do that. Now, here's also a very interesting one. I felt like a victim but didn't want to act on it for fear of my peers, supervisors, or others thinking I was a wimp or whiner making a big deal out of it. Well, this is a culture change that needs to happen. I have likened police officers to domestic violence victims. Well, you know, that's just part of what I do. I'm going to go back into that same environment with no justice. Nobody really cares. There's nothing I can do about it. And that victimization mindset is not healthy, particularly when we think about the frequency. Again, those incidents just in a year's time among the officers surveyed are cumulative, the stress and the physical injuries. You wrench your back on an arrest for somebody that resists, and then you may be involved in an accident later. You may have another violent encounter with an offender, and over a 10, 15, 20-year career, that might happen 20, 30, 40, 50 times. And near the end of that career, you're saying, oh, my back, I have chronic pain. I've got these joint problems. My knees are worn out. And you say, well, I need to get some compensation. I need to get some disability for that. Well, you don't have any record of it. So how can we say that that's job related or that's a cumulative condition? So that is a problem. Now, I'll just quote, and this happens to be the Mississippi statute because this was one of the last presentations I made. Victims of crime as defined by law shall have the right to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect throughout the criminal justice process, and to be informed, to be present, and to be heard when authorized by law during public hearings. And again, that is in the majority of cases just not happening. So there we have it, folks. We need to be more cognizant. We need to do this by policy and by training and by practice to treat our officers with the same dignity that the system demands of law enforcement and prosecutors when they're dealing with civilian victims of crime. Now, a lot of times when we talk about police officers, well, there's police officers and there's citizens. I don't like to use that phrasing because police officers are citizens with all of the same rights and responsibilities, plus their professional obligations. So I talk about civilians versus police officers. Well, I hope that's given a little bit of perspective on what we need to be doing and what we need to be improving in law enforcement, and to recognize the widespread violent victimization of our police officers that goes largely unanswered by our peers, by our supervisors, by our leaders, and by our prosecutors. That needs to change. I hope it does. I'm Dr. J. Franklin Schultz with the Police Perspective.
Underserved.